Flies buzzed relentless around the infant's cracked lips. Hattie's thick fingers, blistered from crawling through alkali dust, couldn't swat them away anymore. Her husband's wagon tracks were already blowing away in the merciless wind. She was going to die here, heavy and unwanted, burying her son under the sagebrush. Heat did not just press down on the plains. It smothered them. It baked the moisture out of the scrub grass and turned the salt flats into a blinding, white-hot mirror. Hattie lay on her side, her cheek pressed against the coarse, cracked earth. The vibration of her own shallow breathing seemed to stir the dust around her nose. Underneath the heavy surge of her traveling dress, her body was a furnace. Sweat pooled in the deep creases under her breasts, across the wide shelf of her stomach, and down the thick columns of her thighs. The wool chafed her raw. Hours ago, she had managed to pry off her corset, leaving the stiff, whalebone cage abandoned like a dead pale beetle a few yards away. It had been her husband's parting gift, a cruel insistence that she maintain appearances, even as he systematically unloaded their provisions to lighten his wagon, ultimately deciding that a plump wife and a colicky baby were the heaviest cargo of all. He hadn't left a note, just a cloud of dust and the lingering, sickeningly sweet smell of his lilac pomade fading into the arid wind. Beside her, little Thomas let out a dry, reedy whimper. He didn't have the moisture left to cry properly. Hattie dragged her heavy arm over the dirt, her thick, dirt-caked fingers finding the boy's chest. She patted him. A slow, rhythmic thump that took more energy than she could afford. She was a large woman. Back in Ohio, her size had meant prosperity. She was the baker's daughter, built like a fortress of dough and cream. Out here in the territory, her mass was just a liability. It meant she needed more water. It meant her joints ached with every step. It meant when she collapsed, she went down hard, and getting back up was a battle against gravity she was currently losing. A low, rhythmic groaning broke through the ringing in her ears. Hattie didn't open her eyes at first. Delirium was a known companion to the dying, but the sound persisted. Creak, thud, creak, thud. The heavy, plodding rhythm of hooves and ungreased wooden wheels. She forced her eyelids apart. The salt from her sweat burned her corneas. Through a haze of shimmering heat, a shape materialized. It wasn't a sleek prairie schooner or a cavalry detail. It was a battered, flat-bedded wagon pulled by two mules that looked as mean and stringy as the man driving them. The man yanked the reins. The mules halted, blowing hot air from their flared nostrils. Silence settled over the brush, heavy and expectant. Gideon did not jump down right away. He sat on the bench, a long rifle resting casually across his knees, and stared at the lump of dark fabric ruining the landscape. He chewed the inside of his cheek. He smelled of pine pitch, stale animal fat, and wood smoke scents baked permanently into his fringed buckskins. He was a man who lived in the high altitudes, only coming down to the flats when he had pelts to trade and powder to buy. He hated the plains. He hated the heat. And he profoundly hated complications. And, "You dead, woman?" His voice was like two stones grinding together. Rough, entirely devoid of pity. Hattie tried to speak. Her tongue was a dry sponge glued to the roof of her mouth. She managed a harsh, clicking wheeze, lifting her head just an inch. Then, sensing the audience, Thomas let out another pathetic, scratching wail. Gideon swore softly. It wasn't an exclamation of shock. It was a curse of profound inconvenience. He swung down from the wagon. His boots hit the dust with a heavy thud. He didn't rush. He walked over to her with the slow, deliberate pace of a man inspecting a trap. When he stood over her, he blocked out the sun. Hattie looked up into a face, obscured by a wild, tangled beard and dirt in the deep lines around his eyes. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like something the mountains had chewed up and spit out. "Ain't no water out here," Gideon stated the obvious, looking past her to the horizon. "Your party get hit?" Hattie shook her head minutely. She raised a trembling hand, pointing a thick, blistered finger at the empty wheel ruts leading westward. Gideon followed her gesture. He looked back down at her, taking in the sheer size of her. the discarded corset, the baby wrapped in filthy linen. He understood immediately. Men dumped things they couldn't pull: pianos, cast iron stoves, armoires. Sometimes they dumped people. "Well," Gideon muttered, "ain't that a mess?" He knelt. He didn't offer a gentle hand or a reassuring smile. He grabbed a dented tin canteen from his belt, unscrewed the cork with his teeth, and shoved the rim against her cracked lips. Small swallows. "You puke it up, you ain't getting more." The water was hot and tasted heavily of tin and sulfur. To Hattie, it was divine. She swallowed, choked, coughed violently, her heavy chest heaving, and then drank again. He pulled it away before she was done. "The boy," she rasped, her voice sounding like tearing canvas. Gideon looked at the baby. He tipped a few drops onto his calloused, dirty thumb and pressed it to the infant's lips. The baby sucked weakly. "I can't lift you," Gideon said bluntly, standing back up and putting the stopper in the canteen. "You're too big. You got to get up on your own." Hattie felt a flush of deep, familiar shame burn through the exhaustion. Even here, half dead in the dirt, her body was an obstacle, an offense. But the shame was quickly swallowed by a surge of pure, jagged survival instinct. She was not going to die here just to prove her husband right. She rolled onto her hands and knees. The effort made her vision swim. Her broad shoulders shook, and the thick flesh of her arms wobbled under her own weight. She breathed in ragged gasps, her lungs fighting for the thin, hot air. Gideon watched her. He didn't mock her, but he didn't help her either. He just waited, a silent, immovable fixture in the dust, until she finally managed to stagger to her feet, swaying like a felled tree. "Wagon's round the back," he said, turning on his heel. "Grab the kid. Let's go." The back of the wagon was a chaotic cavern of raw survival. As Hattie dragged herself over the dropped tailgate, a humiliating, undignified scramble that required her to hook her heavy leg over the wood and haul her mass upward while clutching Thomas to her chest. She was hit by a wall of smells: cured hides, rancid tallow, the metallic tang of bear traps, and the sharp ammonia scent of raw wool. It was dark under the heavy canvas cover, but the heat was trapped, turning the space into a suffocating oven. Gideon threw a stiff, hair-covered buffalo robe over a crate of salt pork. "Sit there. Don't touch the traps. They're set." Hattie collapsed onto the robe. The coarse fur immediately scratched at the exposed raw skin of her forearms and neck. She didn't care. She was off her feet. She clutched Thomas tightly, curling her large body inward, making herself as small as she possibly could, a habit she had perfected over a lifetime of taking up too much space. The wagon lurched forward. The jolt snapped her teeth together. Every rut in the trail, every rock the wooden wheels hit, transferred directly into her spine. It was a brutal, bone-jarring ride. There were no springs on this mountain cart. It was built for hauling dead weight, not nursing mothers. Hours bled into one another. The only sounds were the creaking of the timber, the rhythmic snorting of the mules, and the shifting of cargo. Gideon didn't speak. He sat on the driver's bench, a rigid silhouette against the blinding square of light at the front of the canvas. Hattie focused entirely on her son. In the dim light, she unbuttoned the bodice of her dress. Her hands were clumsy, her thick fingers still trembling from the exertion. She guided the baby to her breast. Her flesh was sweaty and covered in a fine layer of grit. But Thomas didn't care. He latched on fiercely, drawing whatever meager nourishment her dehydrated body could still produce. She looked down at her own stomach, resting heavily on her lap. It was a landscape of soft, rolling flesh, currently bruised and coated in dust. Her husband used to pinch it, not with affection, but with a sneer of disgust. "You eat through our stores faster than a plague of locusts, Hattie," he had said just 3 days ago. Now, in the belly of this stranger's wagon, she realized her fat was the only reason she was still producing milk. Her body was eating itself to keep the boy alive. For the first time in her 26 years, she didn't hate her size. She viewed it with a grim, cynical gratitude. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted with violent speed. The oppressive heat vanished, replaced by a biting, high desert chill that seeped right through the canvas. The wagon rolled to a stop. Hattie heard Gideon jump down. He began moving around the campsite, his footsteps heavy. He didn't check on her. He didn't ask how she fared. He simply unhitched the mules, hobbled them, and began pulling dry scrub wood from a sling under the wagon bed. Within minutes, the sharp smell of a sagebrush fire cut through the stench of the hides. "Out," Gideon's voice commanded from the tailgate. Hattie stiffened. The cold was already setting into her joints, locking them in place. Getting out of the wagon with the baby was just as hard as getting in. She moved slowly, her thighs burning, her knees popping loud enough for him to hear. She swung her legs over the edge and dropped down. Her ankles screamed in protest under her weight as she hit the uneven ground. She walked toward the fire, moving with a heavy, rolling gait. Gideon was squatting by the flames, a cast-iron skillet in his hand. He tossed a chunk of pale, hard grease into the pan. It sizzled violently. Hattie stood awkwardly at the edge of the firelight. She didn't know where to sit. She didn't know what the rules were with a man like this. He wasn't a gentleman. He was an animal wearing clothes. "Sit," he grunted, not looking up. He gestured with a dirt-caked finger to a flat rock near the fire. She lowered herself onto the rock. The heat from the flames washed over her face, highlighting the deep exhaustion in her pale eyes. Thomas was asleep against her chest, tucked inside her shawl. Gideon pulled a strip of dried meat from a pouch and tossed it at her. It hit her in the shoulder and fell into her lap. It looked like boot leather and smelled of smoke. "Chew it slow," he said. "Get your spit working." Hattie picked it up. She tore a piece off with her teeth. It was tough, heavily salted, and tasted of old blood. It was the best thing she had ever eaten. She chewed mechanically, her jaw aching. They sat in heavy silence. The vast, empty darkness of the territory pressed in on them, held back only by the small circle of firelight. Gideon finally looked at her. He didn't stare at her chest or her face. His eyes swept over her with a cold, calculating assessment, like he was judging the yield of a slaughtered elk. "Your man leave you because you're slow? Or because you eat too much?" he asked. The question wasn't laced with malice. It was purely inquisitive, stripped of any polite pretense. Hattie stopped chewing. A hot spike of anger shot through her chest, momentarily burning away the fatigue. She stared at the fire, her heavy jaw set. "He left me because he is a coward," Hattie said, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly register. "And because I am fat, he figured the mules couldn't pull the weight over the pass. So he lightened the load." Gideon absorbed this. He poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of orange sparks into the black sky. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't tell her her husband was a fool or that she had a pretty face underneath the dirt. "Mules are meant to pull," Gideon said softly, staring into the coals. "A man who blames the cargo for his own weak team ain't worth the dirt he walks on." He didn't say anything else. He just scraped the melted grease around the skillet, leaving Hattie sitting in the cold air, chewing on dried meat, trying to figure out if she had just been insulted or understood. Altitude shifted the air from a suffocating blanket to a knife edge. As the wagon groaned its way up into the foothills, the alkali dust was replaced by the sharp, medicinal scent of crushed juniper berries and damp granite. Hattie huddled under the buffalo robe, her teeth clicking together in a continuous, uncontrollable rhythm. Her serge dress, once a baking oven, was now entirely inadequate against the biting crosswinds. The trail narrowed. It wasn't a road. It was a suggestion of a path worn by elk and the occasional desperate trapper. Gideon drove the mules relentlessly, his jaw set, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines. He drove them until the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, plunging the canyon into premature, freezing twilight. They hit the river, crossing an hour before true dark. It was a fast-moving black ribbon of snowmelt churning over slick, algae-coated river stones. Gideon halted the team. He climbed down, his boots crunching on the frost-heaved mud, and walked to the water's edge. He spat into the current. "Water's up," he muttered, turning back to the wagon. "Gonna be a hard pull. Hold the kid tight." He cracked the whip. The mules surged forward, their hooves slipping on the wet rocks. The wagon plunged into the freezing water. Immediately, Icy runoff flooded over the floorboards, soaking into the hems of Hattie's skirts. She gasped, pulling her legs up, clutching Thomas to her collarbone. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that stole her breath. The mules strained, their muscles bunching under stringy hides. The front wheels caught the opposite bank, hauling upward, but the back wheels sank, deep. The heavy, iron-rimmed timber dropped into a hidden trench of sucking mud with a violent, bone-rattling thud. The mules screamed, digging their hooves into the bank, but the wagon didn't budge. They were anchored in the muck. Gideon swore. It was a vicious, continuous stream of profanity that echoed off the canyon walls. He threw the reins over the bench and waded into the waist-deep water. The cold didn't seem to register on him. He grabbed a thick, waterlogged branch from the bank and wedged it under the axle, putting his shoulder to the wood, trying to lever the massive weight. "Pull, you miserable bastards!" he roared at the mules. They pulled. The branch snapped with the sound of a gunshot. Gideon pitched forward into the freezing water, going completely under. Hattie watched him surface, gasping, mud clinging to his beard. He struck the side of the wagon with a closed fist, a gesture of pure, impotent rage. He couldn't lift it. He was strong, but he was wire and sinew. He lacked the sheer mass required to counteract the mud. Hattie looked at Thomas. He was crying now, a thin, miserable wail. She tucked him deep into the buffalo robe, wedging him securely against a crate of dry goods where he wouldn't roll. Then she stood up. Her joints screamed. Her muscles, locked from the cold and the brutal ride, protested every millimeter of movement. She didn't say a word. She climbed over the tailgate and dropped into the river. The water hit her waist. It felt like 1,000 needles driving into her flesh. The current immediately tried to sweep her heavy legs out from under her, but her bulk anchored her. Her boots sank deep into the riverbed. Gideon wiped muddy water from his eyes and stared at her. "Get back in the wagon, woman. You'll freeze to death." Hattie ignored him. She waded to the rear wheel, the mud sucking at her boots with loud, wet smacks. She wedged herself between the muddy bank and the heavy iron rim of the wheel. Her sodden dress weighed another 20 pounds, dragging her down. "You can't lift that," Gideon snarled, shivering violently now. "You're just going to break your back." "Get another lever," Hattie growled, her voice a deep, guttural rumble she didn't recognize. "When I push, you pry. Make the mules pull." Gideon stared at her for a fraction of a second. He saw the grim, terrifying set of her heavy jaw. He waded to the bank, dragged a massive, half-rotted log into the water, and shoved it under the axle. "On 3, he grunted. 1, 2, 3. Hattie threw her weight against the wheel. She didn't use just her arms. She used her broad shoulders, her heavy hips, the thick, powerful columns of her thighs. She dug her boots into the shifting riverbed and pushed. Her muscles tore. Her lungs burned. She felt the mud fighting back, a suction trying to keep its prize. She screamed a raw, ugly sound of pure exertion. The wheel groaned. It shifted an inch. "Again!" Gideon roared, throwing all his leverage onto the log. Hattie closed her eyes and drove forward. Her body, the very thing her husband had discarded as useless baggage, became a battering ram. The fat, the muscle, the heavy bones. She weaponized all of it against the river. With a sickening schlup, the suction broke. The wagon lurched forward. Gideon cracked the whip on the bank. The mules scrambled, panicked, and dragged the wagon up out of the riverbed, the back wheels slamming onto solid ground. Hattie fell forward into the shallow water, her hands sinking into the freezing mud. She lay there for a moment, her massive chest heaving, the freezing water washing over her face. She couldn't feel her fingers. She couldn't feel her toes. But she felt the solid, undeniable reality of the earth beneath her. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel. Gideon stood over her. He was dripping wet, his chest heaving. He reached down, grabbing her by the thick fabric of her coat at the shoulder, and hauled her to her feet. It wasn't a gentle pull. It was a rough, necessary hoist. They stood inches apart, both shivering violently, both covered in freezing slime. Gideon didn't insult her. He didn't tell her she was a liability. He looked at her broad shoulders, her mud-streaked face, and the sheer, unmovable reality of her presence. "Get in the wagon," he said, his voice entirely stripped of its previous contempt. "Before your boy freezes." Gideon's cabin was not a home. It was a fortress built against the elements. Wedged into a cleft of raw granite near the timberline, it was constructed of thick, unpeeled pine logs packed tightly with mud and horsehair. Inside, it smelled of isolation. The air was thick with the scent of old wood smoke, curing pelts and a deep, masculine neglect. When they arrived, the snow had already begun to fall dry, hard flakes that hissed against the canvas of the wagon. Hattie was completely numb. Gideon practically had to carry her inside, depositing her heavily onto a crude rope bed piled with bearskins. He shoved Thomas into her arms, then spent the next hour violently stoking the massive stone hearth, until the iron stovepipe glowed a dull, angry cherry red. For 2 days, Hattie didn't move from the bed. The exhaustion had seeped into her marrow. Gideon moved around her like a ghost, coming and going in a flurry of snow and cold air, tossing chopped wood onto the pile, throwing a hunk of roasted venison onto a tin plate beside her. He never asked how she felt. He simply provided the calories required to keep her blood pumping. On the 3rd day, the trembling finally stopped. Hattie sat up. The cabin was empty. The silence of the high mountains was absolute, thick enough to drown in. She looked around. Dust coated every flat surface. A sack of flour sat slumped in the corner, heavily chewed by mice. A bucket of solid gray lard rested near the hearth. Hattie swung her heavy legs over the side of the bed. Her body ached, a deep, bruising pain that reminded her she was still alive. She wrapped Thomas tightly, set him securely in a wooden crate near the fire, and walked to the flour sack. She was a baker's daughter. Before her husband had decided he wanted a thinner, more fragile wife for his western adventure, her hands had known the alchemy of wheat, fat, and heat. She found a dented tin basin. She scooped the flour, careful to avoid the mouse droppings. She chipped away a lump of the gray lard. There was no yeast, but she found a jar of sour, bubbling starter hidden behind a stack of rusty traps. It smelled like fermented apples and old beer. She rolled up her sleeves, exposing her thick, pale forearms. She began to work. When Gideon returned hours later, kicking the snow off his boots against the doorframe, he stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy, metallic smell of his life had been hijacked. The cabin was filled with the thick, intoxicating aroma of baking bread and rendering fat. The iron stove, usually spitting and smoking, was radiating a steady, even heat. Hattie stood by the makeshift counter. She had found a piece of flat slate to use as a board. She was scraping dough from her thick fingers. She didn't look up when he entered. "Found your starter," she said, her voice raspy. "It needed feeding. Was dying." Gideon slowly closed the door. He unslung his rifle and leaned it against the wall. He walked to the stove. Sitting on a flat cast-iron griddle were 4 massive, irregular biscuits, golden brown and crusty. He didn't ask. He reached out with a scarred, dirty hand and picked one up. It was hot enough to burn his calluses, but he tore it in half anyway. Steam plumed into the dim air. He took a bite. It was sour, heavy, and tasted of old lard. To Gideon, who had eaten nothing but jerky, salted pork, and hardtack for 6 months, it tasted like salvation. He closed his eyes, his heavy jaw working slowly. Hattie watched him out of the corner of her eye. She saw the tension bleed out of his shoulders. She saw the wild, hunted look in his eyes soften, just for a fraction of a second. "Pass is closed," Gideon said abruptly, swallowing the dense bread. "Snow's 5 feet deep at the ridge. You ain't leaving till May." He expected tears. He expected hysteria. Women from the flats always cried when the mountains trapped them. Hattie picked up a rag and wiped the slate clean. "Good," she said simply. Gideon paused, halfway through the second half of the biscuit. "Good?" Hattie finally turned to look at him. Her face was plain, round, and currently flushed from the heat of the stove, but her eyes were flint. "A man who leaves his wife in the dust won't survive a winter out here," she said, her voice steady. "He'll freeze, or he'll starve, or he'll catch a bullet in some shanty town." By May, I'll be a widow, which means I won't have to look over my shoulder. She turned back to the stove. Eat the rest. It's better hot. Gideon stared at her broad back. He looked at the gentle, heavy sway of her hips under the coarse fabric. He looked at the baby, sleeping quietly in the crate, warm and fed. For years, Gideon had viewed his isolation as a shield. People were liabilities. They required food. They made noise. They brought trouble. But as the winter wind began to howl, violently slamming against the mud-packed walls, Gideon realized the cabin didn't feel crowded. It felt anchored. The massive woman standing at his stove wasn't a burden. She was ballast. He pulled a three-legged stool close to the hearth, sitting down with a heavy sigh. He watched her pull the next batch of bread from the heat. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The wind screamed outside, but inside, the air was warm, smelling of yeast and survival, and a quiet, brutal kind of grace. If this gritty tale of survival and unexpected mountain romance kept you hooked, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with fellow fans of raw, authentic Western dramas, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories from the untamed frontier. Drop a comment below. Would you have survived the winter in Gideon's cabin? Ring the bell so you never miss an upload.